Hey guys, welcome back to Coach Hall Writes. Today's video is going to be about time management for the 2020 AP Lang exam. One thing that I recommend students do is to create a timeline. And so basically you want to establish parameters for each portion of your essay. Now I've given you guys a sample here. This sample might work for several students, but it might not work for everybody. So you are welcome to do something different or adjust the time frames as needed. But basically what I did is I broke it down in the left column to explain the different parts of the essay. You could be more specific than this if you want to be, but the idea is that you're going to need time to read the passage. You're also going to need time to write your intro, your body paragraphs, possibly a conclusion, and you need to submit. So you need to figure out the different steps that you're going to take. Then you need to figure out the maximum amount of time that you intend to spend on each of these, because sometimes when we're writing, we might only intend to spend 10 minutes on something, but if we don't actually establish that in the beginning, we might spend 15 minutes. We might lose track of time. So I put the maximum amount of time that I would spend on these things if it were my essay in that middle column. And then in the right column, I did sort of like the time that would be remaining on the clock. And the reason why is because, to be honest, I can do simple math under normal circumstances, but under the pressure of the exam, adding and subtracting is way harder than it actually should be. And so if that sounds at all familiar to you, then you might want to include the time that would be remaining. That way you don't have to try to figure out if you're on track or not. You would just know, okay, wait a minute, there's supposed to be 40 minutes left. It says 41, I'm good. So have some sort of tentative plan. That way you can pace yourself in order to get all the parts of the essay done. There is going to be a timer on your exam, and so you do have the option to get rid of the timer if you want to. I recommend that you check the timer, or at least check your time throughout your essay experience. That being said, you want to make sure that you're doing it at appropriate intervals. So please don't check the time if you're reading or writing in your mid-sentence, because you could lose your place or you could lose your train of thought. So make sure that you're at least at the end of a paragraph or at an appropriate stopping point, and then you do your time check. Okay, so as far as reading the passage, a lot of students feel like they take too long to read the passage, but then if they rush, they feel like they don't understand. So one thing to do is to find out your annotation style in advance. And this might be very different based on the online test as opposed to what you did in class. So I have some students who take relatively few annotations. They read it, they understand it, they've got it all in their head, and that works for them. And on exam day, they need to do that. I have other students who tend to need more annotations, and it might take them longer to read the passage, but they need that extra time to understand it, and then they can write a stronger essay. So it's really important that you make the decisions that are best for you. As teachers, we can make recommendations. Like, for instance, I might suggest not to spend more than 10 minutes reading the passage, but if you need 12 minutes and that's going to be the difference between you feeling confident and not confident, then you need to do what is best for you. It's your exam, you're a young adult, you need to make some of these decisions for yourself. Sometimes students actually have trouble with staying grounded in the passage. I know that for me, if I'm really stressed out, or if my head hurts, or if I just really don't like the passage, my mind might wander. And so I tend to either use my finger or a pencil to track where I'm going. Sometimes I mumble the passage out loud or I mouth along with it, and that helps me keep focused. So that might be a tip for you. Now, if you are using a touchscreen device, I would probably not touch the screen during the exam, just because you don't want to cause any technical difficulties. Now, as far as I know, there would be no issue with you kind of talking to yourself through the exam, because there is a big difference between talking to yourself and talking to somebody else. But if you're not comfortable with that, then I would say don't do so. But every once in a while, it helps to just kind of be like, okay, now wait a minute, what are they saying? Or maybe just kind of read it very quietly to yourself, because it might help if you're an auditory person to hear the passage as well. So please make these decisions based on what you think is best for you. I would not recommend reading a particular paragraph more than twice. Oftentimes, if the paragraph is a bit confusing, if students move on, then the next paragraph might help clarify it, because the author might be building their argument, and so it might make sense if you read the next paragraph. And so please don't get stuck rereading the same paragraph 3 or 4 times, because that is going to waste your time. If you don't understand one paragraph out of the whole passage, just move on, because quite frankly, there's going to be other things that you could analyze. And I know it's tempting to be like, but if I don't understand this, I might be missing something. And that might be true, but at the same time, you've only got 45 minutes. And so just allow yourself to have permission to move on. If you are faced with a very dense paragraph, maybe it's very long, the sentences might be a bit involved, maybe the language is a bit more complicated because it's from, say, like the 1800s or something, it might help you to, instead of reading the entire paragraph, read a couple sentences and kind of do a comprehension check before moving on. Because sometimes if you stop at smaller intervals, it allows you to take a second to process it and to understand. And so there's no shame in reading a couple sentences and then stopping. Or maybe you read a paragraph and then stop and kind of summarize it in your head or on your paper. That way you understand the passage a little bit better. So this next bit of advice is going to sound a little bit cliche, but you don't want to get in your own head. Now, as a high school student, I would have found this advice incredibly frustrating, because there were times when people would say, you got to just calm down, don't worry about it, don't psych yourself out. But I felt like I couldn't help it. And so I don't mean to be belittling when I say this. I'm simply speaking as a teacher who's trying to advise you for a 45-minute exam. There are times when we tend to defeat ourselves before something is over, and quite frankly, it wastes our time. So if your passage is really challenging, or if you get stuck in your essay, don't allow the self-doubt to creep in. And I want you to think of this as positive self-talk. So instead of saying, man, this is the worst essay I've ever written, say, you know what? This is a challenge and I'm going to face it. I'm going to do the best I can. And I know that might sound super corny, but if you turn it into an I can instead of an I can't, you're probably not going to waste as much time. And quite frankly, oftentimes students tend to think that they've done worse than they actually did. I cannot tell you how many times kids tell me, Coach Hall, this is the worst essay I've ever done. And it's actually not. There still is merit to the essay. And so you don't know how your essay is going to fare. It might not be as strong as the essay that you wrote 2 months ago. It might not be your favorite passage ever. That's okay, because what you need to recognize is that you are being evaluated based on your individual essay. So stay grounded in that essay, rely on your training from class, and just do the best you can. But don't start thinking, oh my goodness, I've failed, because you haven't even submitted it yet. So you still have time to fix it. So just do the best you can. Just get as much analysis as you can on that page and be confident in yourself. It might not be your best work. That's okay, but you have accomplished something, and so don't let that self-doubt prevent you from doing your best. I would recommend that students actually have a plan, and this is going to look different depending on your preferences. Some students might be able to just sort of do this in their head. Other students might need to do some bullet points. This does not have to be very detailed, but I find that it helps if students ask themselves, okay, what am I going to write about in body paragraph 1? What am I going to write about in body paragraph 2? Am I going to write a third paragraph? If so, what is in body paragraph 3? And having this plan can help you, because if you get stuck or you lose your train of thought, you will have a plan to go back to. It's kind of like your roadmap. And also, if you feel like you're running out of time, it will allow you to prioritize what you think is the most important analysis to include. One major time-saving tip is to not write a lengthy intro. Now, some students are capable of writing a well-developed intro. They just tend to have a knack for it, and they do it rather quickly. Sometimes it really depends on the passage and your interpretation of it or your connection to it. So the most important thing is to have a thesis. If you find that you are struggling with getting started, you need to just write that thesis. That thesis should include some context. So context is going to be that you need to give specifics about the passage. You need to identify the writer, the audience if that's given in the prompt, the occasion, so why are they writing, what type of passage is it, things like that. You need to include that, and then your thesis is going to be when you actually specify the choices that the writer makes and their purpose, as well as either their message or their argument. So depending on what your prompt is, you need to make sure that you are truly answering that prompt as specifically as possible. Now, you can include the context and thesis together in one sentence. There are sentence frames that allow for this. or you could do it in 2 separate sentences. It's whatever you think is going to serve you best in the moment. If you have a sentence frame that you like, that you think you could use effectively, or an example of a sentence that you think was a really good thesis statement from a previous essay that you could kind of turn into a sentence frame, I would recommend having that in your notes because it is an open note exam. And so you want to have something that you can do quickly. You don't want to spend an inordinate amount of time writing your intro. And so if you tend to not be able to start your essay, one way to save time is to have that thesis statement sentence frame ready. It might feel a bit cookie cutter. Other people might have a similar sentence frame. It's really okay. It's not cheating, and their essay is not necessarily going to be similar to yours. This is a way to get started. To be honest, most students probably already know this, but sometimes under pressure, we revert back to habits that we've already broken. And so I want to remind you guys not to use long quotes because long quotes detract from the quality of your essay, and taking the time to rewrite a long quote is going to waste your time. Instead, you want to embed shorter quotes or phrases into a sentence of your own. This is going to read better, and it's going to allow you to not waste time. You're going to be able to get to your commentary more quickly and arguably more naturally. As far as crossing out or deleting certain portions of your essay, you need to use your best judgment. There are times when I've been writing and I felt compelled to delete something, and if I didn't delete it, it would actually really bug me. And so if that's the case, then just get rid of it. But what you need to do is, if you're handwriting your essay, you don't want to cross out your entire sentence and make it so dark that no one can ever read it, because if you just strike through it and draw one line through it, your reader is not going to read it. So don't waste time trying to scribble out sentences because it takes a little bit longer, and quite frankly, it makes your paper look a little bit messier. So just cross it out very simply and move on. Now, if you're using a computer, I would recommend that you actually select the text. So you're going to highlight what you want to get rid of and then delete it that way, simply because sometimes when you hit the backspace, or if you're using a Mac, the delete key, a bunch of times you might accidentally delete more than you intended, or it might seem like it's not deleting and then suddenly you've deleted like an entire sentence and you didn't mean to. So I think you might be able to be a bit more precise and avoid the opportunity to have to hit that undo button a bunch of times if you simply just select the portion that you want to get rid of and delete it. But obviously you guys are adept at using computers, so do what works best for you, but ask yourself, do I really need to get rid of this? If you totally misinterpreted the passage or something, then yes, get rid of it. But if the sentence is not that bad, it might not be your absolute best, then maybe you need to keep it and just move on, because we're not looking for perfection. You can still have a strong essay and a well-scoring essay, even if it's not perfect. So we don't want to necessarily, put every single word on trial and waste time looking for this perfect sentence. We want to just get the words on the page. You also need to remember that it is about quality, not quantity. So some students tend to struggle with their pacing because they want to try to squeeze in 3 body paragraphs, or they want to know exactly how many sentences they need per paragraph, and there isn't a magical number. I have seen some very well written 2 body paragraph essays. I've also seen some really good 3 body paragraph essays. Conversely, I've seen some not so great 2 body paragraph or 3 body paragraph essays. So don't worry about mastering a certain quota. Worry about what your essay needs. You want to make sure that you are developing your ideas, and that takes a while. So if you only have time for 2 body paragraphs, that's okay. Don't rush or cut yourself short just to squeeze in a 3rd body paragraph if that's going to be counterproductive. Sometimes students feel like they waste time because they don't know what else to say. So remember that you want to connect it to purpose. So for instance, if you're really struggling with purpose, you might ask yourself, okay, to what? Or in order to what? Or you might say something like, doing so allows, or doing so creates. These are simple phrases that can help you work in the purpose. And so if you struggle with purpose, have those in the back of your brain somewhere. Now, if you struggle with commentary in general, you might ask yourself, okay, so what? Or why is this significant? Now, these questions might not be helpful to everybody. I did do some videos rather recently about rhetorical analysis commentary that hopefully break it down a bit more specifically. But if you're really struggling in that moment and you're like, I don't know what else to say, ask yourself, why does this matter? Why is it significant? Another thing that you can do if you get stuck with your commentary is to start to examine the rhetorical situation. So maybe you include some analysis of tone, or maybe you ask yourself why the author chose this particular choice for this audience on this occasion. So if you think about the rhetorical situation, chances are you might not have included something like the purpose yet, or a deep analysis of the message. And that can help you remember, okay, wait a minute, I was supposed to talk about that in this paragraph, or hey, I haven't really addressed that yet in my essay. Here would be a good time to talk about that. I also want you guys to recognize that it is okay to pause and gather your thoughts. I know that I personally sometimes feel overwhelmed, and if I feel like I'm racing a clock, I just want to keep going and going and going. But sometimes I need to remember that I need to breathe. I need to take a second to actually think about what I'm doing, and it is okay to have those moments. You don't want them to take too long, but you don't have to be feverishly typing for the entire 45 minutes. You might need to gather your thoughts, gather your mental state, and that is totally okay. If that's what you need, then please take a few seconds to do so and then move on. Another time management issue that students run into is not having enough time to write a conclusion. And so if you feel like your time would be better spent on your body paragraphs, I would encourage you to focus on those body paragraphs, because I think you are probably going to be more likely to improve your evidence and commentary score if you do so. Now, if you do have time to write a conclusion, I would recommend that you start by restating your thesis, simply because if it wasn't defensible in your intro, you might be able to write a defensible thesis in your conclusion. And also sometimes, even if it is defensible in the intro, students write a stronger thesis in their conclusion as they're kind of recapping everything, because they have had time to gather their thoughts and kind of figure out what their argument is. So that might be a place to start. I know that some people don't like it when students kind of wrap up everything because it feels really forced. You've kind of just said all those things. But if you only have a couple minutes, that might be something that would serve you well. You could also think about the big picture. So you could think about the historical implications of the passage or the social commentary behind the passage, whatever is most relevant. So my best advice for conclusions would be that if you have time to write one, then try to do so, but it's okay if it feels a little bit short because you only have 45 minutes. If you think your time would be better spent on those body paragraphs, don't feel bad about not having a conclusion. This is just a rough draft. In terms of time management, it is incredibly important to recognize that as soon as the timer hits 5 minutes, it's going to turn red. That is when you should submit. And I know it's probably going to be tempting to want to reread your essay just one more time or fine-tune a couple things, but that could take longer than you think, or submitting could take longer than you realize. So nothing that you do in those 2 to 3 minutes of the submission window to try to fix your exam is probably going to amount to anything in terms of your score. So you don't need to worry about final touches. You need to submit. Now, some students have had issues submitting. So the College Board has said that for this week, week 2 of AP testing, if you submit your response and you basically get an error message that says that your response was not submitted and you know you did, then you're going to be presented with an email address, and you need to be able to immediately email your submission to that email address. And so that is really helpful because that was a server error. However, there are certain human errors that we want to avoid, and one of them is mismanaging our time. So please just submit as soon as that timer turns red. You also want to practice how you're going to submit in advance, because taking individual photos of your pieces of paper, for instance, could take more time. If you don't know where your file is being downloaded to, that could take more time. Little things like that. So make sure that you are prepared to submit as soon as there are 5 minutes left. And if your essay is not 100% polished, or as polished as you would want it to be, you need to just let that go. It is better to get a score than to run out of time and not be able to submit. So in thinking about all of these tips, I would encourage you to identify your traps, because I've gone over a lot of little tips, but they might not apply to each of you. So what you need to do is think about how you write an essay and where you tend to lose time. So if you are the type of student who tends to spend too long reading a passage and you lose track of time, you might want to practice that. So you might want to tell yourself, I'm going to spend no more than 10 minutes on this. And maybe you go to the College Board's website and you pull up a couple exam passages and you just practice reading something more quickly and taking your notes in the way that you want to. If you're the type of person who understands the passage, but you don't know how to start your essay, maybe you find a sentence frame that you like and you have that ready to go. Maybe you practice using that sentence frame. That way you can write a thesis statement more quickly. If you're the type of person who tends to not get to your conclusion, then hopefully my tip that you might not need one will give you a little bit of peace of mind. So my advice is not to try to tackle all of the things, but rather to be very systematic. Focus on one or two things that you think will help you the most, because you don't want to overwhelm yourself. This is not the time to completely overhaul your process, but rather to fine-tune your process. So figure out where you are losing time the most and figure out what you need to do to use that time a bit more efficiently. If you guys have any final questions about preparing for the test or rhetorical analysis in general, let me know in the comments below. I do try to respond to everybody, but I'm also working on a final Q&A video, so I would love to have some questions to answer for that. And as always, until next time, guys, happy writing!